Hello, chess friends, and welcome to the Chess channel, and welcome to the event that we have been waiting for. Welcome to the TCEC season 21. So I'm really happy that finally this new TCEC season has started, because the TCEC season, I think, is the most prestigious tournament when it comes to chess engines. There are of course other tournaments, but I think this TCEC tournament are really wild. First of all, the games are much longer, so this is not the blitz bullet or rapid chess. This is classical time format chess between the top engines. So as I said, these engines have now time to calculate positions, have to really time to find the best next continuation. So I think in this TCEC seasons we see also the best games and the most accurate games. So we're starting now with a great gameplay by Stockfish 13 against another top engine, Allie&Stein. It's already bloodbath in round one. Be prepared. This is simply again wild fish stuff. So here Stockfish opened with the move knight to f3. Although these moves are pre-arranged, I'll tell you of course till which moment this game was pre-arranged. So after move knight to f3, we have d6, still pre-arranged line, c4 by Stockfish, knight to d7, d4, we have g6, and after knight to c3, knight to f6 and e4, bishop to g7, basically the game that's transposed into the King's Indian structure. After the move bishop to e2, we have now castling by Allie&Stein and also castling by Stockfish 13. And now comes the move e5, still pre-arranged. And what I don't like already in this pre-arranged line for black is this setup, this move knight to d7 instead of this move knight to c6. If you're familiar with the King's Indian, with the move knight to c6, I think it's much sharper line. You're already battling for the d4 square. With the move knight to d7, first of all, what we can notice, you're blocking out your light square bishop, and also you're not battling for the d4 square. So you see already this pre-arranged line for black is not the best line in the King's Indian, so that's why already a slightly advantage here for white. But still more moves were pre-arranged. After move e5, here bishop to e3 was also pre-arranged by the organizer, and now the last pre-arranged move was the move a6, and this is actually also a move I simply don't like. What we can notice always that after potential maybe a5 or here, or maybe d5, let's see possible continuation. I think with the move b6 and then knight to c5, black is always trying in this structure. So when you have already moved your knight to d7, is trying to build sort of a blockade here on dashwards with the move knight to c5. And you see with the move a6, and if you want to build this blockade idea, then basically you have lost the tempo, because you have already played your move a6, and then maybe in the continuation of the game you want to play a5. So that's why I simply don't like the pre-arranged line. My Stockfish engine at home shows already a +1 evaluation for white, so you know when Stockfish has a +1 evaluation in an early stage of the game, that Stockfish is basically brutalizing in the continuation of the game. So as I said, a6, the last pre-arranged move. Let's see now how both of these engines handled this position. So here Stockfish undermines the pressure in the center immediately with the move d takes e5. We have d takes e5. What we can notice now, the pawn structure is symmetrical, and it's not a dynamic pawn structure anymore. What black has as an advantage is of course this square d4. Black would love to occupy this square because white has already advanced the pawn on c4 and e4, so no pawn moves can happen in order to protect your d4 square. So this advanced pawns sometimes can cost you also some games. So as I said, the main strategical goal here for black is simply an outpost around the square d4. But as I said, I simply don't like here the setup knight to d7, knight to f6. The bishop is a little bit blocked out, so you still need many tempi in order to improve your minor piece activity for black. So here in the continuation, queen to c2, normal ideas. We want to get of course rook to d1 here, getting the rook where already the queen is, and also protect our weak d4 square in the continuation of the game. So c6, we have now knight to d2. Here h5 by Allie&Stein. This is a very interesting idea, because one of the main problems also for black now in this position is that you have basically a bad bishop here on g7. So in the continuation of the game, maybe black could try ideas like king to h7 and maybe even bishop to h6, getting rid of this bad bishop, because the bad bishop on g7 is simply blocked out by its own pawn. Or you could try maybe different ideas, maybe king to h8, maybe knight to g8, and then bishop to h6. This could be also an idea to somehow trade off your bad piece for white's great piece, because what we can notice here, that dark square bishop of white is simply a great piece. It controls both of these diagonals. So when we compare the dark square activity of whites and blacks, I think white is much better. So here in the continuation we have h3, preventing of course the move knight to g4. Here in the continuation, queen to e7 played by Allie&Stein, and now comes the move knight to b3. Here knight to h7 was played by Allie&Stein. If you try now maybe b5 to expand here on the queen side, actually it's not so good, because you get simply here the move knight to a5. The maneuver here by Stockfish, knight to d2, knight to b3 was really a cool idea. Now you see with both of these knights, I think white has here a pleasant game. Basically black would be forced to play a really bad move, knight to b8. You don't want to get your knight, of course, on the starting square, and I think again black would have really some trouble in continuation to develop this knight on the b8. Meanwhile, of course, white will activate some other pieces, can also maybe play something like c takes b5 in order also maybe to open the c file. So I think when it comes to piece activity, again white is much better. So after move knight to b3, we have knight to h7. As I said, we have now knight to a4. We wanted to have a further control of the c5. Now black is really in serious position trouble, because white now here after move knight to g5 played simply c5. Great here move by Stockfish, paralyzing simply the whole queen side. You see the whole queen side is simply paralyzed by one pawn move. Although this is now a very dangerous knight, but you don't have any support, because here, as we said, Allie&Stein tried this at maneuver knight to e6. We said in the beginning of the video that the d4 square is the main weakness, the main positional weakness of whites here, but it can be protected here by the normal move rook to d1, which of course Stockfish 13 played. So great positional setup, I think, here by Stockfish 13. So this is not really one of the most brutal attacks that we used to see sometimes by Stockfish 13. This is a great positional approach in the game. Rook to b8 was played, and now rook to d2, simply doubling up the rooks on the d file. So here queen to h5. Allie&Stein gets also very active with the pieces, but now a great move by Stockfish, bishop to f1. What we want to do is now, of course, to play the move g3, simply kicking away the queen, because then the h3 pawn would be hanging. So now with the move bishop to f1, we have protected the h3 square. So here knight to f6. Allie&Stein is maneuvering some other pieces into the attack. Now the e4 pawn is hanging, so that's why f3 is a must move. And now queen to g3. Here if you try knight to f4, it seemed to me in the beginning that it could be maybe a great move, but actually it's not so, because there is now a great defensive idea here for white. Bishop to f2. Okay, maybe black could attack further position here, also threatening some ideas of knight takes h3. But now with the move h4, basically white can solve all of the position problems. Now the queen has to retreat, and now the queen is basically on a weird square. So there is, as I said, a great way here for white to defend this position. So after move f3, here queen to g3 was played by Allie&Stein. We have bishop to f2, again the same idea, queen to g4, and now queen to c1. Knight to h7, here queen to e1 was played by Stockfish 13. If you try now rook to d6, it seemed to me also like a great idea to maybe occupy now the 6th rank, because you could have really great activity with your rook, because there is also this pawn on c5. And when I also learned some chess, then I always try to support the squares that are supported by this pawn. So in the beginning, as I said, it seemed to me that it could be a logical idea here to play the move rook to d6, but actually now the move knight to f4 could actually work, because the queen is now under pressure here, because here if you try now the move h4, now it's not possible to play this defensive idea, because you get knight to h3, and then if you move the king, now we can take rook takes c1, and now you lose the bishop. So this is now a whole different position. So that's why white needs to be careful with some active moves. So as I said, rook to d6 is not a possibility here in the continuation. Queen to e1 played by Stockfish 13, and now bishop to f6 by Allie&Stein. We have h4, again kicking away the queen, and now queen to h6. Knight to b6. Very important move. This knight, of course, has to be very activated, because it's, of course, on the edge of the board. And now Stockfish 13 is also searching for some maneuvers. Knight to c4, and then knight to d6. When one of these knights gets on d6, this will be the so-called octopus knight, a supported knight, very centralized knight. Of course, it will be then the best minor piece on the board. So here, after move knight to f4, king to h1, played by Stockfish 13, we have g5. You see, Allie&Stein is also breaking the position, like in the normal King's Indian structures. Black is always trying to get some kingside attacks. Here we have g3, kicking away the knight, knight to g6, and now knight to c8, getting rid of the bishop, because in many King's Indian games, the light square bishop of blacks is basically the best minor piece. There are always some tactical possibilities with his bishop. So basically, here white got rid of this very annoying bishop on c8. In the King's Indian, as I said, many times you see that this would be the best minor piece on the board of black. So I'm sorry if you hear some sounds. I have some construction workers in the next apartment, so maybe you hear some sounds. I'm sorry about that. So here, after move rook to c8, we have bishop to e3. Stockfish continues the pressure, pins also this pawn. Now the queen could be hanging, so that's why here queen to g7 has to be played, getting out of this potential tactical mess. And here bishop to h3, here played by Stockfish 13, attacking simply the rook, and we have now rook to d8. Here rook to g2. You see how Stockfish changes the direction of the attack. Many pieces now are on the g file. The queen, the rook, the queen, the king is now simply attacked by the rook. If you open the g file too much, then you could really lose some decisive material. So in the continuation, Allie&Stein tried here the move g takes h4. We have g takes h4, and now king to h8, getting at least with one of these pieces out of this tactical mess. Because if you try now bishop to h4 immediately, then you get simply rook takes g6. That's the main tactical threat here. If you take out the queen, of course, first we take out the queen with the check, and then we can also take out the bishop, and you lose too much material. White is simply winning this position. So after move g takes h4, we have king to h8, so getting out of this mess. We have bishop to f5. Here Stockfish continues the pressure here against this knight on g6. We have rook to g8, and now knight to a5. Very interesting idea, but it's a logical idea. As we said, we want to simply occupy this very weak square on d6. In the continuation, now finally bishop to h4. Now this idea, of course, is not working with the move rook to g6, because you get simply f takes g6 and nothing changed. You can maybe try to take out this one, but also your bishop is hanging here on f5. So here after move bishop to h4, queen to c3 was played. There is now also a very nice idea here of Stockfish to attack simply further the weak e5 square, because knight to c4 is happening. Then we could get rid of this very annoying knight on g6, and then maybe attack here also the weak e5 pawn, maybe with also some ideas like f4, and then maybe to play something like bishop to d4, getting this bishop on this long diagonal. So there are many great tactical possibilities, I think, here for white. White has here a great setup, although white lost now a pawn, but this is not such an important pawn, because Stockfish will build simply this rook battery on the g file. The pieces are very active, and I think the most important thing is this knight that will finally come into the game through the square c4, where it can attack, of course, the weak d6 square, but also the weak e5 pawn. So here queen to f6 was played. We have knight to c4. Here knight to e7 was played by Allie&Stein. If you try knight to f4, maybe to cement your knight here on this very active square, actually it's not so good, because you get simply rook takes g8. After king to g8, we can play again rook to g1. Again, you have to move, and now we can simply take out here this pawn on e5, because you cannot do this fork. I've analyzed, for instance, this line. You cannot do this fork because you get a very cool checkmate knight to f7. So here you could do maybe something else. You could try maybe rook to f8 in order to protect your position, but now your knight is hanging, so again it's a lost game here simply for black. So you see, knight to f4, as I said, seemed to me in the beginning that it's a perfect move. You're centralizing the knight, but it's not possible because of this tactical threats by Stockfish 13. So here after move knight to e7, Stockfish 13 simply attacks the bishop with the move rook to h2. We have rook from b to e8, and now knight to d6. If you try here knight to f5 instead of this move rook to e8, it's again not so good, because you get simply e takes f5. Here you could try maybe to simplify the position with the move bishop to g5, but again this idea is very important. Knight to d6 is also protecting the f5 pawn. You can maybe try to trade it off, but now after queen to e3, you could maybe try to advance the pawn if you don't want to lose it. But now comes this move. This move, I think, is simply winning tactically here for white, because if you take, of course, you get the fork. You have to move the king, and now also this pawn is hanging, so this pawn will be lost. Now with the support of this pawns, white would have basically here two extra pawns. The problems now, you cannot also attack with the move king to f6, because you get simply the fork on d7. So really wild stuff what Stockfish has prepared here. So that said, after move rook to h2, we have now rook to e8. So here Allie&Stein didn't take out the bishop on f5. Here we have knight to d6, now finally protecting the bishop. We have now knight to f5, but now again a similar position happened here. After e takes f5, we have rook to e7, we have rook to f1, bishop to g5. Again, as I said, similar position, basically a different mover. We have now rook to h5, bishop takes e3, here queen to e3, and now you although white has this double pawn structure, but this activity by the rook on the h file is simply too much to handle. Here in the continuation we have rook to d7, rook to f2, of course with ideas to play rook to h2, building a rook battery on the h file. We have queen to g7, now comes this idea rook to h2. Both rooks are protecting here, also this g2 square, also the g1 square is protected, so this queen and rook battery is not something that should bother white in the continuation of the game. So we have now f6, we have rook to h6, continuing the pressure. We have queen to f8, and now f4. Here Allie&Stein passed through with the move e4 because Allie&Stein tried to close the position. The problem is now if you take e takes f4, it gets really wild. You get here a very cool move, queen to e6. Now if you try rook to g7, the problem is now this one, you get rook takes h7, and you see now how wild this tactic can become, because after rook to h7 we have this one, queen to d7, and you cannot take, of course, because of the pin by the rook here on the h file. You would be pretty much forced here to maybe trade off the rooks, and now you can maybe try some checks, but actually you don't have perpetuals, and then this is again a completely winning endgame here for white. So here after the move f4, as said, Allie&Stein tried to close the position with the move e4. We have rook to g6, we have b6, and now rook to g2, continuing the pressure. Here we have rook takes g6, we have f takes g6, so now the pawns are undoubled, and the most important thing is that this is now a mobile pawn. In the continuation of the game we have queen to h6 attacking the king, but not a problem. We have king to g1, queen to h5, and here knight to e4, here played by Stockfish. Okay, we have here this check, rook to d1, but again the problem is that black doesn't have perpetual checks. We have king to f2, we have queen to h4, knight to g3, and again you see the knight is hanging. We have knight to f8, and now king to f3. You see how Stockfish found really some great squares for the king. Now the knight is basically the best protective piece here. The knight is protecting also the h5 square, but also it protects the f1 square, so no checks are possible here for black. In the continuation of the game we have queen to h6 here by Allie&Stein. If you try now knight to g6, this is really wild. You get this one, queen to e8, so you cannot take the pawn. This is really annoying pawn here on g6. You get the check. If you try here to play, of course, king to g7, you get to fork on f5, so you would be forced to play king to h7. But now queen to f7 is again simply winning the game. We can take out, and again you have only maybe one check, but nothing dramatically is changing. Here is of course rook to d3 is not possible, so no checks are possible. That's the most important thing. So white is winning this game for sure. So as said, after move king to f3, we have queen to h6. Now comes again the similar idea, queen to e8. So you see this queen is basically paralyzing both of these pieces, because if you take with the queen you lose the knight, with the knight you cannot take, so it's again a simply lost game here for black. If you try again this idea, king to g7, then again you get this fork on f5. So this is pretty much the main tactic that Stockfish has prepared here. So in the continuation we have rook to d4. If you try maybe a check, rook to d3, nothing special. Again king to e2, no more checks are possible, so this is not something that should basically bother here white in the continuation of the game. So we have queen to e8, rook to d4. We have now a very cool move here, rook to h2, because if you take now, of course, then you get checkmated with queen to f8, and the game is simply over. So rook to h2 here in the continuation. Allie&Stein tried to counterattack, but now comes this move, king to g2. We have rook to f2, king to f2, queen takes h2, now king to f3, but again no checks are possible. That's the most important thing. And now after move c takes b6, look at this tactic, all of this wild stuff just in order to take this pawn and create the pass pawn. Really beautiful chess game here by Stockfish 13. You see the tension was all over the board through the whole game here, and now with taking the pawn, white has created this extra pass pawn, and it's now a completely winning endgame here. In the continuation we have queen to g6, 6. We have queen to f8, king to h7. Now here simply pushing the pawn further, promote the queen. Here only one check is possible. Now a new check, king to h3. No more checks are possible. We have now queen to d7, queen takes d7, king to g5, and now after the move queen to g7, it was a checkmate. So brilliant game played by Stockfish 13 against Allie&Stein. I really enjoyed this game. All of this wild tactics just in order to create this tiny little pass pawn that was promoted into queen. Really brilliant tactics. I really enjoyed the game. As I said, this tournament already started really wild. Stockfish got now this win, and also in the second game Stockfish won the second game and drew the third game with black pieces against Lila C0. So 2.5 points out of the 3 first games played by Stockfish 13. And as I said, playing a draw with the black pieces against Lila C0 is also a great accomplishment, I think. So it will be, I think, a brutal tournament for the fish. So be prepared. This is really wild stuff what will happen now in the continuation of the tournament. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game like I did. I'm really glad that this TCEC season all again started. If you want to see more brutal attacks like this, check out my commented chess games played by computer series with some more Alpha 0, Lila 0, Stockfish 13 games, and many more. And if you want to see humans battling in their best chess games, check out my best chess games of all time series. Here's also the link. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.